Long overshadowed by the sit-ins that began in Greensboro on February 1st, 1960, the sit-in movement in neighboring Winston-Salem, North Carolina, offers its own powerful story and historical significance. This peaceful demonstration began on February 8, 1960, and was concluded after only 107 days with the voluntary and nonviolent integration of the city lunch counters.
It was all done with love. We all developed not only a sense of humor, but a sense of knowing that you can overcome difficulty. You know, they say things like, oh, I'm sorry, we don't feed niggers. And we say, hey, we don't want to eat niggers. We'd rather have French fries, you know?
I don't recall fear. I do recall another emotion, almost an elation. I can't explain it. Other than that, it was a high. It was a sense of, I am doing the right thing. It doesn't matter what the consequences are.
There's certain things I can't not do and still be the me I want to be and aspire to be.
The arrest of protesting students from Winston-Salem Teachers College and Wake Forest College on February 23, 1960, was a flashpoint in the protest. And these students, along with community leader and activist Carl Matthews, were the first demonstrators in the area to be brought to trial. What began as an act of conscience for those who took a stand against injustice effectively changed the way we live.
And I think the students had the idea, and I was working pretty closely with the community, is that things had to get better. They couldn't get any worse.
I just happened to run into them on the campus that day. And they had on coats and ties, which was as odd then as it is now. And asked them where they were going. They told me, and I said, well, I think I'd like to go with you. So I ran home, got on my coat and tie, and that was absolutely all the preparation I had for the participation in this thing.
Overall, when you look at it, the demonstrations have made the community a much better place for all of us.
So I've been out there for quite some time, still fighting.
We shall overcome. We shall.
The formal institution of Jim Crow segregation began in 1896 with the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Over 50 years later, the Brown versus Board of Education decision and accelerating protests against segregation began the reversal of Jim Crow.
The sit-in movement represented a dramatic shift in many, many respects from the nature of protests that had gone on in the 1950s. With the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Southern states had an opportunity to desegregate, and in many cases elected not to. And that led to a new kind of organization among black communities for change, to press for true desegregation of educational institutions. And that movement came through black churches. So, and it came through the kind of the cooperative efforts that black churches made with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And in many respects, that movement represented a middle-class movement of black religious leaders coming together for change. So the sit-in movement represented a shift in that students were now very much involved in the effort, taking on a new role and working in a direction or in a way that the SCLC had some not misgivings about, but some questions about. And the sit-in movement is going to be a wonderful launching point for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we're going to see the whole civil rights movement take on a much more, while still nonviolent, a much more dramatic presentation, I guess, of these sorts of issues. And they're also going to begin to capture more of the national attention, because these are dramatic moments where students are going to lunch counters and being pushed out and physically threatened and responding in a nonviolent way. So it's going to change the nature of the protest movement from what was largely middle class and reactive to one that is taking the offensive. And it shouldn't surprise us in some ways, because students are a wonderful population for affecting social change. They don't have families to feed. They do not have to worry about mortgages in the way that older people do. Their jobs are not circumscribed by the status quo. So in many respects, I think students have perhaps the least to lose and the most to gain from being involved. And so the sit-ins really begin that process of student involvement. So it's very, very important. And it's bringing that national attention to the movement, first local and then state, and then national attention to the movement, that makes politicians have to pay attention.
Community leader Carl Matthews organized and trained Winston-Salem Teachers College students in the appropriate practice of civil disobedience. Students from Wake Forest felt less prepared.
I grew up through the 40s and 50s in Piedmont, North Carolina, in Statesville, North Carolina. Our culture was racially segregated, of course. And I can't find answers to the question in my early childhood, why would I participate in a sit-in to change a pattern that was really to my benefit. As a white male, I profited by this arrangement. But I also grew up during a time during the Second World War. Tom Brokaw talks about the greatest generation in his popular novel. But the greatest generation who participated with valor in the war returned to a segregated society. And through that period, I must have heard a lot about freedom and equality. And it began to sink in. And the implications were pretty obvious. Segregation was wrong. When I got to Wake Forest, I'm sure that these ideas continued to be nourished in religion, ethics classes, Dr. Bryan's class in particular, the influence of Ed Chrisman in the BSU. These no doubt had a powerful impact. They spoke clearly and directly about the inequities of segregation. So when other students from the black community began to demonstrate, it only seemed right that I join in their demonstration.
They were in many ways a kind of a student that was seeking a wider a vision and perspective on life than simply the ordinary Wake Forest student. And I wasn't too surprised when they were engaged in it. And one of the things that I had taught was, of course, civil disobedience. I myself had acted that out, and I myself had been in jail. So on civil disobedient activities. Well, at that particular time, that was, of course, heresy for Wake Forest atmosphere, the last thing on earth the university expected in terms of the Baptist sponsors and the trustees and the administration was that they would actually have students on the street practicing civil disobedience. The other thing that kicked them off and got them to leave the campus and go to the street in civil disobedience was a sense of justice, a sense of unfairness. I don't know that you can teach that to anybody. I've always said I've never taught ethics to anybody because there's no way to teach a sense of justice or a sense of fairness or a sense of risk involving helping somebody else who is disadvantaged. But somehow these 10 students, all of whom I knew very well, took that risk on the spur of the moment. And when they got down there, of course, they found themselves in the most awkward position of suddenly being arrested, which they had not anticipated, as they all say.
I had a sort of a background through my family in terms of civil rights and human rights. My mother had been a protester in Ohio for the right for women on her job to wear trousers, slacks, pants. I had an aunt who had been very active in political circles in Ohio. I have a first cousin who was the first, Negro was the term we used then, to attend the University of North Carolina Medical School. So that was not particularly new to me. We had also been, as children, involved in political campaigns, NAACP campaigns in Ohio. So this was not something foreign to me.
I arrived at Winston-Salem Teachers College in 1954. My first year I didn't adjust. I left and I went off to the United States Air Force. And from that experience, I mean, I saw an awful lot of segregation in the Air Force, San Antonio and Cheyenne, Wyoming, and being a person representing the United States government, I felt as though that was a great injustice in the military. After returning from the Air Force, I returned to Winston-Salem Teachers College and saw the same injustices. And of course, the start of the sit-in movement gave us the thrust. I think 3 days after the movement, we had received a call, and of course, it was Carl Matthews that was the test case. And from that point on, I got involved as one of the representatives from the NAACP at the college chapter at Winston-Salem to see if we could right a wrong. And that's where it started.
Well, one of the things that we were determined was that we were going to keep it non-violent. This was the key, that it had to be a non-violent situation. And we would discuss who we would use to go sit where, in what place, how many people would go sit, so that we could keep a flow of people going in case something happens, like a jail instance or something like that.
On February the 8th, Carl Matthews went downtown and sat at the lunch counters. Jefferson Diggs, Billy Bright, and I were somewhat friends of Carl, and we heard about it the next morning. So we joined him on February the 9th, because we just didn't want him down there by himself. We thought it was the appropriate thing to do because the three of us had been veterans, and we had been discharged from the United States Army, and we were veteran students on that campus. And I thought it was about time that we needed to make some changes in this community here. This was not the first time that we had protested. In 1955, I was a paratrooper in the United States Army at Fort Bragg, and they had the segregated buses, and we began protesting where we were sitting on those buses in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we began to see a difference, some changes were being made. So this was not our first protest. We knew that we had to get out and fight for the things that were right.
It's my girlfriend at the time, actually fiance at the time, was Margaret Ann Dutton. We were 2 of 3 seniors that were involved in the sit-in, and we married the day before graduation. Graduation back then was June the 6th, much later than today, because our wedding anniversary is June the 5th. But sadly, Margaret died almost 21 years ago and left me to raise alone our 2 children. But she was very much involved. She was one of the 4 of us that went over to the Teachers College. And the distinctive thing was that she was the person who was put on the witness stand when the trial came. And so she played a prominent role both in terms of organizing as well as being involved in the trial and the aftermath. I believe Margaret was near the head of the group going in. I think she came to this sign that said for employees or for personnel and their guests, which was obviously a subterfuge for maintaining a segregated lunch counter. And she asked if she could come in, and apparently the person there said yes. And she was followed then by a couple of black students and probably a couple of the Wake Forest students as well. One of the things that happened is that she ordered a cup of coffee and pie, and then passed it to one of the young women from Teachers College. I believe that that woman's name was Dolores, maybe Dolores Reeves, I'm not quite sure. Margaret was accused of ordering under false pretenses and then sharing what she had ordered with somebody else.
This was my fight for my rights, and I had an immediate and personal stake in it. I had not learned to that point to globalize it. And interestingly enough, George Williamson said something, I don't even know if he remembers it now, but when he said, "This is our fight," that was a turning point. And to realize the risks, I don't mean so much physical risks, that the Wake Forest students were taking in terms of the fact that many of them were ostracized on campus, many of them lost friends, many of them suffered at the hands of their own families. They alienated their own families, and they were willing to do that. This really, really personalizes it, but I felt they're willing to do that for me. And that also was a turning point in that whole movement, in that it was no longer just a bunch of black kids from TC, which Winston-Salem State University was at that time. It was also no longer, as was so easy to say, a bunch of northern agitators. These were their own kids, their own sons and daughters. And I think that it changed a consciousness of the entire city and the entire nation, that people began to look at it was no longer a matter of other, but of us.
I remember walking in the Woolworths and seeing, my recollection, I'm not sure this is what actually happened or what others remember, my recollection is that the police were already there, that the manager of the store we'd gone in first had called ahead, and the manager of the second store had called the police, and they got there before we did. Anyway, whether they were there or whether they came soon, my recollection is of Chief Waller, the chief of police in Winston-Salem, introducing himself and telling us that we had 3 minutes to leave. And the reason I remember his name is that my grandmother had told me 2.5 years before, when I came to Wake Forest, to be sure and look up her best friend, Ms. Waller's son, who's chief of police in Winston-Salem, and I had, of course, never intended to do that, always assured her that someday I would, and there he was, telling me I could leave or be arrested. And I don't know at what point it became obvious to me that all the black and some of the white kids had gone down there with a clear either expectation of being arrested or at least were prepared for that as a possibility, but I certainly was not, and I had no idea about that. The people in Greensboro had not yet been arrested, nor had anyone else in this context. And I just didn't know what to do. Some sort of solidarity with the group, I guess, kept me from leaving, though I remember 2 or 3 of the white kids actually did leave. I remember vividly walking out of the Woolworths and seeing the hatred in the eyes of the white people on the sidewalk, and how searing and unprecedented in my experience that was. And I remember being in the jail cell, and what a cultural shock that was for me. The people in there assumed, they somehow heard that we were arrested because of this sit-in, and they assumed that I was a white person who was harassing or attacking the black sit-inners. So they were congratulating me and patting me on the back. These were drunk guys in the tank, and I remember mumbling out that no, I was in the sit-in, and remember being then shunned even in the jail cell because of like I had some disease or something like that.
Well, I remember John Gold. I remember he was the city manager at that time, and I could tell that he was getting irate with us because we had been out there about 15 days demonstrating, and I guess when the Wake Forest students came and joined us, that put this little heat on the fire there. But it didn't really seem like we weren't afraid to be arrested, because I guess being veterans, we were getting checked, so that was not a problem. I was concerned about how my parents would feel about it because they were living in this community here, and I knew that there were a lot of black people, and some of the leaders at our school over there they were really not pushing us. They were afraid. They thought we were going to get hurt or something. So arresting was not really one thing that we were concerned about. We were just concerned that we stayed together and kept the movement alive, and that's what we did.
That was the first day that the Wake Forest students came down to sit with us, and it was really great. It was a lot of fun because this is the first time that we're now showing that we have power, that we're able to bring others in to help us with our situation. So we met and we went to the store, went in, and John Gold, who was the city manager at that time, a gentleman by the name of Benton was the mayor, but John Gold was the man. And he had said to us the day before, if you come back down here tomorrow, you will be arrested. It was not a promise, it was the truth, because he did arrest us. Well, it was my job to, before getting in the wagon for everybody else, to get in touch with our lawyers and the people in the community that could get us bailed out so that we could all get out of the rest. But even in jail, it was fun, because I never forget, I'm trying to remember the young man's name. I know that his parents were with Lay's potato chips, but they took us in for fingerprinting, and every one of the black students they searched. This young man, when he got through fingerprinting, pulled out a knife and cleaned his fingernails, and nobody said anything to him and nobody took the knife. But each one of us, they patted us down and went through our pockets to make sure that we didn't have any type of weapon. But he cleaned his fingernails with a knife. I never forget, that's why I always remember that day.
I recall I think it was either the manager or the chief of police who approached me and says, Mr. Bradley, you're one of the student leaders and you are in violation of a city ordinance. And I would like for you to tell the students that if they did not leave the store, that they would be arrested. He gave me a megaphone, and he told me to address the students, and I called them. I was at the top of the stairway, and I called the students together, and I said that the chief of police or the manager of police is saying that we are in violation of a city ordinance. I say that we have a constitution, and before I could get that out, I was swept off the steps and arrested, and I guess so many of the others were arrested at the same time. And the first time, I think, in my life, I felt an air of fear, because being in that jail cell is nothing to talk about. And you know, growing up, you heard so many stories of lynching and people being taken out and never being seen before. And so for a few short moments, I was very, very fearful.
They paired a Wake Forest student with a TC student. They did put us in separate paddy wagons and take us to separate parts of the jail. But at the moment of being arrested, we were together. And the other thing that fascinated me, it really surprised me too, and if I can look at it in hindsight, it sort of, whoa, shocked me. Because when they proposed the bail, it was the students from Wake Forest who said, no, we are not going to accept bail until this is won. And I remember thinking, hey, it's all right to go to jail, but now I don't want us to stay in jail. And that entire period is a very, very influential part of what my life has been about ever since, and is now.
There were unexpected consequences for some of the student protesters.
What happened to me that day was the total collapse of my world. I came out of jail, well, I actually came out of Woolworth's to see a crowd of white people looking mostly at me and the other white kids, much more than at the black kids, and a look of intense hatred on their faces that I had never seen before. And then the subsequent alienation with my family, the feeling of alienation with my circles of friends and colleagues on the campus, most of the faculty, and all of Southern white culture was just about overwhelming to me, and I lost everything that day, really everything, and I couldn't understand it. I had been altogether unprepared for what happened, and so I had to start from scratch, and with the help of a very few people, Mac Bryan on the faculty here being one of them, being probably the most important of them, I very, very slowly began to crawl out of the fog and the chaos and put together a new life on the other side of the Jim Crow system, of which I'd been altogether complacent and even happy constituent part all my life. And what got put together was somebody who was now finding my identity in a kind of religiously, biblically motivated opposition to the kind of racial injustice that I had come to experience, or was coming to experience, as I was beginning to learn little by little what it was really like. And that became that became my identity for a while. The identity of someone who is a passionate, true believer in the movement. That's what there was I now could see and taste and feel the empowerment of a movement that was going on, and I became very much activated by that, albeit also intimidated because I didn't understand. I wasn't a black person. I didn't have anything like the realism that all of them had about the world. There were so many things about the world that I was little by little learning that I didn't understand. It wasn't that I was learning these things, it was just that I was learning that I didn't understand these things.
Well, it was a very, very difficult choice because I was leading some of the student athletes. I played basketball at Winston-Salem, and we had an outstanding coach, of course, Big House Gaines, a legend, but because we were on scholarship, a state-supported school, I recall one occasion where we were basically called together and all the students were basically warned that if they continued, that they would basically lose their scholarship. So I had a choice to make, and I made the choice to continue the struggle. And of course I lost my scholarships, but I'm thankful to Big House Gaines because he had a private talk and he said, Don, you understand, the realities of this situation, but if you have principles, if you really believe in something, then you have to stand firm in your beliefs. So I made that stand. Lost my scholarship, but thank God for the GI Bill. And some other support from CORE and the NAACP and other residents here in the city. Some of the white churches and the black churches, they fed the students and gave us an awful lot of support.
The 60s definitely made a change in the American way of life as far as blacks were concerned. And I think all of us that were around then and helped kind of halfway guide those guys, we've followed them all the way through. We're glad to see that they're successful.
So we were arrested and tried for trespassing and found guilty, and then the sentence was changed to a prayer for judgment. Those were not serious consequences, although they may have seemed quite serious at the time, but there were other consequences as a result. I returned to campus after the arrest, went to my first class, and found that I was not a very popular guy on campus. My teacher told me immediately that if I had time for extracurricular activities, I obviously had more time to prepare for his class. It was a language class, and I was called upon to translate for the entire period, and the next period, and the period after that. That may have gone on as long as 2 weeks. I learned a lot of language in a short period of time.
When it was all over, President Tribble, who was in president at the time, called the students into the trustee room to have a meeting after it was all over. They'd been tried and sentenced, and they were back on campus. And he invited the chairman of the board of trustees, who was a distinguished lawyer in Winston-Salem, Irvin Carlisle, and myself to be present at that meeting. And I had no idea what was going to happen. But to make a long story short, he addressed them in more what would be called a dressing down. That you've made a witness, you've made your point, but the real point of being a student is being in your room studying and being in the classroom and not rabble-rousing on the streets. There was nothing about, we're proud of you, we're backing you. There's nothing of that at all. And when the students heard this particular brush-off, they sat in silence. I remember with vivid clarity. And I was a little bit shocked at this dressing down. And then one student, whom I considered, I knew them all very well by that time, one of the most unlikely one to make this speech, jumped up and said, "Dr. Tribble, if you're trying to tell me to put up and shut up, I want to say to you that I have just been through the most shameful judicial system, and I had never imagined from my civic book training that anything like this would ever happen to me. And we were condemned for being communists, which is as far as anything could be true. Said we had a moral sense, and we felt we were doing what God wanted us to do. And he said, I'm not going to shut up, I'm going to spend the rest of my life working on this. And the rest of the students broke out in prolonged applause. And that to me was a dramatic moment in the life of these students, because they were saying once again, even to the structure, which they in many ways had disobeyed, that it has meant so much to us what we've done that we're going to live with a new way of life. And most of them have said that their jail experience was like a curtain. One day they did this, and the next day they did this, and their life was changed entirely from that moment.
One of the things that happened as a result of this sit-in and arrest and conviction is that we received various responses. And Margaret received a couple of hate letters. One of them is just unbelievable to read, and yet the man signed his name. And he said, if you want to talk about this, come see me. But also, she received a number of supportive letters. One of them was from McNeil Smith, who was a prominent attorney in Greensboro. Another from the minister of her church, which was the West Market Street United Methodist Church. And from faculty, including wives of faculty that she didn't know. But the person who probably received some of the most severe criticism was her father, who sadly received a lot of criticism. How could he raise a daughter like that, kind of thing? Even from members of his own Sunday school class. People take a long time to rise above their prejudices. Some people just cannot do it, and it's very sad. Sometimes it just takes the emergence of the next generation.
We march actually from February the 8th until May the 23rd when this thing, see that one day, 23rd is a real important day going to jail, but the march was actually over three months, and we were happy that we were able to get these people to understand that we were not going to give up. And I remember vividly on the 25th when the lunch counters finally opened, when Carl Matthews was the first black to be served.
It changed all of us significantly because it's so easy to diminish your self-worth when you are told that you must be separate. You have to drink out of a separate water fountain. Oh no, you can't use this bathroom. I mean, I lived in the summers, I was in Newark and in New York with my family. So I knew there was another way of life, you know, but this was home. This is where my love was. And I think we all became very much aware of our own humanity. We became aware of the need to not only feel the dignity that we have in ourselves, but to show other people that we are in fact worthy of respect, and that no, we don't have to bow and scrape and take a back seat. You know, that we're human and you're human.
"40 years after the arrest of Carl Matthews and students from Wake Forest College and Winston-Salem Teachers College, a commemorative marker was erected in downtown Winston-Salem, near the site of their arrest. On a public level, the action of those sitting in changed the way our society functions. On a personal level, the experience was a powerful one for the students who participated.
And so I've sort of dedicated my life into just challenging the wrongs. And I think I went into education as a teacher and spent 34 years in education and recently just retired from education, but always encouraging young people that the nonviolent movement is a movement that you can undertake, but you always have to challenge those things that's wrong. And there's more good, you know, in the world than bad, but you just have to pull that out of people and let them know. And color should never be a factor.
The term protester is used to describe us sometimes. It's used in the literature. I don't think I thought of this as a protest. I now regard it more as an affirmative action. It was an act to affirm values and principles that I think are very important.
It's also incumbent upon us to pass the mantle down to the young ones who come after us so that they will also know about the situation and so that they can also be involved and be vigilant to make America what it should be and what it ought to be for all of us.
I'm hopeful that these persons are now getting their due in terms of what I think should have happened many years ago, and in which the city of Winston-Salem should thank them for what they did in bringing about the phenomenal kinds of changes that have occurred since then.
That statement that I made got to be sort of a little slogan or credo with me. No, I'm not my brother's keeper. I am my brother. And so long as anyone is not free, I'm not free.